Hello, everyone. Thank you again for joining us for one of the third in the series of UN75 dialogues that we have been hosting, hosted by the UN SDG Action Campaign. Just before I go on to talk a little bit about why we're here today, we wanted to share with you the outcome of the polls that were taken just as you were signing in. We realized that we have great interest coming from Asia because about 49% of our of those participating come from Asia. Very, very interesting, the interest out there. And this is also good. And I don't know whether this is in reference to an all-female panelists that we have today, but 55% of our participants today are female. And in terms of the age group, we have leading in terms of participation, the age group of 35 to 50, with those who are 25 to 34 coming in closely. With 30%, while 35 to 50 is about 36% of our audience. And very interesting question with reference to the current economy. The fourth question we have is, do you believe we will improve the global economy after this pandemic? And we seem to have a very, very optimistic audience out there with 66% of you saying that the global economy is going to improve after the pandemic. About 27% unsure. Hopefully this conversation that we're having today is going to give us a perspective of what the future looks like from our very diverse backgrounds. But 2020 marks the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, and as part of the commemorations of the 75th anniversary, the United Nations is having a conversation with the world, with the people of the world. And one of the ways of doing this is through this dialogue. The ground rules of our conversation today, we started with the polling that has been done, but we will do 3 other polls in the course of this dialogue. Please, once those questions come on the screen, we'd like to have your feedback. We want you to join in this conversation. So please make sure that you respond to the questions. They should be run for 30 to 60 seconds. Also, there's a question and answer section, one of the icons on your screen. You drop a question. That do not put your questions in the chat box, put them in the question and answer section. We cannot guarantee that we'll answer all the questions, but we'll do our best to take the questions into consideration as we go along. All participants will have their mics muted throughout this conversation, so don't feel frustrated if your microphone is not on. That's intentional. And then we also have you would notice that we have subtitles going on. They are as accurate as technology can get, and mindful of our different accents. It may not pick them accurately, but that's really intended. We're testing this out to reach out to those who are unable to hear what we are saying, so that they too can be part of this conversation. With that said, we know that the world is going through a pandemic that has had tremendous consequences on the economy of the world. And if we're talking about rebuilding, there's no way we could talk about this, recovering from this, without looking at the economy. A few things that stand out across the world. We've seen headlines like 100 million people go unemployed in India, 40 million in the United States. Across the world, we have seen a tremendous increase in unemployment. From airline to retail companies, we see bankruptcies on the rise. Tourism has taken a big hit, causing enormous hardship on those who depend on it. The stock market is fluctuating in ways that we've not seen before. Who would have thought that oil prices will go down to as negative $37 a barrel at some point? The impact of the economic malaise has been acutely felt by low-income workers, putting a lot of strain on the social services of the various countries where such social services even exist. We have seen that this crisis has demonstrated a fracture in inequality that exists in the various economies within various countries, and we need to do something about it. So we cannot talk about recovery from this health crisis without talking about a recovery from the economic crisis that has come with it. And so we're having this conversation because we want to hear the voices of the people as the United Nations works together with member countries to rebuild after the pandemic. For that, we've put together a team of panelists. I must say that I am here in a minority today, happy minority, to have an all-female panel. This is a dream come true. I would introduce our guest speakers, and we'll go on to the first guest speaker. I will allow the panelists introduce themselves. They will have about a minute to introduce themselves. But we are privileged to be here today because this dialogue is hosted by the UN SDG Action Campaign, and we will have the guest speaker who will do the closing will be Marina Ponte, who is the director of the SDG Action Campaign. We would also have as guest speaker Natalie Sima Singh, who is the Chief of Strategy at the Office of the Special Advisor on the preparations for the commemorations of the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. And she will be doing our opening. We have three panelists that I'm going to come back to, who will get the opportunity to introduce themselves. Just before I go on to introduce our first speaker, we have a survey that we would like you all to take. First of all, the question I have for you all, have you taken the UN survey? If you haven't, this is your opportunity to take one, but we would like to know whether you have taken the UN survey. And we'll keep this running for maybe 30 to 60 seconds. Just take a moment to let us know if you have taken the survey or not. We've seen this percentage continue to grow. And the last time we did this, about 55% of the participants had taken the survey. I'm hoping that we're going to see an increase in the number. This is going to make Natalie and the people at the UN happy to see that there is a lot more participation. So fingers crossed, we continue to see an increase in the number of surveys taken. Oh, great. No, not as great as I wanted it to be. I looked at it wrong. So about 37% of the people here have taken the survey. 66% still have to take the survey. I hope that in the course of this conversation, you're also going to take the survey so that we can make your voices heard. But 37% is a good number to start with. At this point, it gives me great pleasure and honor to invite to open this dialogue the the Chief of Strategy at the Office of the Special Advisor on the preparations for the commemorations of the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, Natalie Samara Singh.
Hello?
Yes, Natalie.
You can hear me. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. It's really great to join Transfermunity and the SDG action campaign for this dialogue on economic transformation. This is a huge, huge area of focus for us, and we are counting on today's lineup of speakers to challenge us and to give us some concrete proposals for action. Now, I work on the 75th anniversary of the UN, but I have no illusions that people will remember 2020 as the year the UN turned 75. This year is going to be defined by COVID-19, and more importantly, by the decisions that we take to tackle the crisis and hopefully to rebuild better. We don't know the extent to which the pandemic is going to shape our future, our ability to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, to take urgent climate action, and so on. But we do know that this is much, much more than a health crisis. Ari gave you some sobering statistics. I'm going to give you a few more. According to the UN Development Programme, the world is on track to experience its first decline in human development since 1990, when the first Human Development Report was produced. And this is due to a triple hit on health, income, and education. Global per capita income is going to fall, we think, by about 4% this year. And that's because around 94% of all the workers in the world live in countries that have had some form of workplace closure. That means they have lost working hours. They have declined by over 10% this quarter compared to last year. That figure doesn't mean much, but it is the equivalent of 305 million full-time jobs that were lost this quarter. Young people have been particularly hard hit. Almost 77% of young workers were working in the informal economy anyway, when the crisis hit. And it is estimated that about 1 in 6 of them have stopped working since then. COVID-19 really has exposed the underlying weaknesses and the entrenched inequalities in all of our systems. The virus is very much not the great equalizer that some said it was. The disadvantaged, the discriminated, the poor, the marginalized, as ever, they have been hit the hardest, and it is they who will feel the impacts for much longer. So it's absolutely vital that we listen to them, to their hopes and fears for the future, to their priorities and solutions. And that really is what UN75 is about. It was never intended to be a celebration, far from it. And we think our mission is now even more important because we have a chance to give people from all walks of life a say in the decisions that are taken now, in deciding where the vast sums of money that will be spent this year are directed. And really, we hope, ensure that these decisions and this money put us on the right track to a better future. It's how are we doing this? So we're doing this through dialogues such as this one. So what you say today will be captured and it will be presented to world leaders when they gather to mark the 75th anniversary in September. And we're doing this through our survey, which you've now heard a lot about already. We've had 200,000 people in 192 countries take it so far. I really urge you to add your voice and also to share it with your networks. We also now have an app to help people collect responses from those who are not online. We certainly don't want to replicate the digital divide in our outreach. I will share with you just one result to date. We asked people, what is the top priority for recovering better from this pandemic? You will not be surprised to learn that access to healthcare is number one. But strengthening global solidarity, solidarity between people and nations is number two. And at number three, a close number three, is rethinking the global economy. People are thinking big. They want big transformations. They're putting forward ambitious proposals from universal basic income to banning fossil fuel subsidies. And it will be up to governments and to the UN to respond in kind. If we do, then I really hope that we will look back at 2020 not as a year of crisis and disaster, but as the year when we finally changed course and put ourselves on track to a safer, fairer, and more sustainable future. So all the best for the discussion today. We will be looking forward to the results. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Natalie, for that. A few things jumped out at me there. Particularly the decline in human development, which is really something that we need to pay attention to, because it's obviously going to take a while for us to recover out of that, but also the significant increase in unemployment amongst young people who are essentially the future and who are, very, very concerned about that future now with everything that's going on, as well as the trends and the results, obviously, with healthcare being looked upon as priority. But what really solidarity amongst people is really the essence of why the United Nations exists and why we're having this conversation across the world. And obviously, the economy, because this is the only way we're going to make people thrive in the new world that we're going to build. So this conversation is absolutely necessary. So thank you so much for that opening that puts in context why we're having this conversation and opens up for us to be able to engage our panelists, our three panelists, and I'm looking forward to hearing from them. They're all young. They're all very, very engaged in whatever they do. I've known most of them over the years and seen the difference that they are making in their various activities. So I'm going to go on to the panelists, and I'll have each one of them introduce themselves. It's going to, each one of them would have about a minute to introduce themselves. So I would like to start with our first panelist, just to make sure, who is none other than Ana Saldarriaga.
Hi, Ari, and everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Ana Maria Saldarriaga, and I'm from Colombia, although I'm currently living in Geneva, and I am working in the World Economic Forum in the division of young people. I am the deputy head for the Global Shapers community, and I am leading the impact strategy of the whole foundation. Prior to this job, I was working in another big NGO called ISEC, where I was the global president. And I also have experience working in tech startups and a bank. And I'm very pleased to be here, especially because I feel that this is more than a panel, a dialogue in which we all can learn from each other. And I look forward to receiving your questions.
Thank you very much, Anna. Thank you for accepting to be here. And I'm looking forward to this conversation with you. The next person we're going to listen to is Cindy Pearl Mapumulo.
Thank you very much, Ari. Yes, so my name is Cindy Pearl Mapumulo. I am from South Africa. I have been an entrepreneur for about 11 years now. I still fall within the youth bracket though. I'm in the business development space. So essentially I work a lot with SMEs, particularly QSEs. What that stands for is qualifying small enterprises in South Africa. So they are separated according to turnover, and so QSEs would be those that are making a turnover between 10 to 50 million. And I also work with government here in South Africa, as well as corporates, specifically their ESD departments. That would be the enterprise supplier development departments in assisting the SMEs that they support. So in a nutshell, that's essentially who I am.
Thank you very much, Pearl. I'll call you Pearl. I'm just getting used to the Cindy name.
Feel free.
Yeah, thank you very much for joining this conversation. I'm also looking forward to getting your perspective. And now we're going to get to meet our third panelist, who is Nisa Jetha.
Hi, Ari. So thank you so much for inviting me to speak. I'm very excited about this forum, and like my other panelists, I think it's quite pertinent and a very telling topic right now. I did also just want to say that I am speaking on behalf of myself at nisajetta.com, and you can follow me on my Twitter, which is NISAA Jetta, alongside my name. By way of background, I'm actually a lawyer qualified, but I was just, I guess, too hungry to do other things. And I am very involved with moving the needle on sustainable finance. So having work across various industry sectors like private equity, corporate law, I was very involved with moving the needle on climate change, being involved with focus groups at COP21, engage women on political participation in parliament, because I feel that's a niche that really needs to go forward, and head the strategy for the British Award for African Development, one of the largest good governance platforms operating out of the UK that has presence in several African countries. And I am involved with like peace, and was awarded the Ambassador for Peace award a couple of years ago. So very excited to be part of this and looking forward. Thank you again.
Well, thank you very much, Nisa, for accepting to join the conversation. Really appreciate all of you being here. Just before we begin the conversation, I've seen in the chat group that some people are asking about how they can take the surveys. So we have that on screen. You can go on and take the survey and be part of the conversation. The world needs your voice. The world needs solidarity. So keep those conversations going in the chat room, and if there are ways in which we can respond, we will. But please remember, if you have a question for the panelists, because a lot is happening in the chat room, in the chat box, we may miss that. Drop your question in the question and answer section, please. All right. With that said, we will go on to begin our conversation, and I would ask this question to all the panelists. This is a question that we're asking the participants as well in the survey. But to the panelists, I'll ask you this question, and I want to you come from very diverse backgrounds from different parts of the world. And so your perspective is really going to be important on this. As we recover from this pandemic, what should the international community prioritize? And I would begin with Anna, if that's okay with you, Anna.
Totally. I think that there are many different options when you answer the survey on what those scenarios could be. And I think all of the answers that are given there are completely valid. And the way that I will answer this question is that there is not one answer that fits everyone's reality. And I think that is the main statement that we all should keep in mind when driving policy at a local level, at a national level, and at a global level. I think that if I were to give a universal advice, it would be to study and prepare for all of the scenarios that are out there. Currently, the Brookings Institute released 6 scenarios of the post-COVID economic recovery, in which you have like very, very positive scenarios that are coming in a Z shape or V shape, and then you have like very negative scenarios in which come in an L shape or in a W shape. But I think that all of us, including civil society, need to study those scenarios and get prepared for all of them and see what would that look for me at an individual level. And then if I am in the country, like in the public sector or in the private sector, what would each scenario look for me in each scenario? Because yeah, the best thing that we can prioritize at this moment is making sure that 3 months from now, 3 years from now, none of us caught us by surprise, that we should be prepared for all of the scenarios.
Absolutely.
I see that there's a question that is asking like, what scenarios are you referring to? And I just want to point you to the study that is available. So you just need to look at post-COVID economic scenarios. And it's the one that is given by Brookings Institute, in which, again, there are 6 phases in which they see the economic recovery happening.
Yeah, thank you very much for catching that conversation and keeping the audience engaged with that. And that's an interesting perspective, right? And looking at ensuring that all of these priorities, that there is not one that we prioritize over another, because all of them are equally as important.
Depending on the context, that's the thing.
Yeah, obviously, as we come from different places. Nisa, what would be your response in terms of following up from what Anna said? What would you prioritize if you had to?
So I actually am quite aligned with what Anna said, because I was looking at the survey and thinking actually all of them have a nexus that lead into something else. And what I've really learned during the crisis is knowledge is key, but knowledge without solutions can be dangerous, right? So I feel like there is this notion of needing to learn and rethink the bubble and constantly finding other avenues. So when we look at the priorities, I would say that for me, I would be, sorry, Ari, are you asking me to answer, or are you asking me to answer Anna's question?
No. I'm asking you to answer your perspective.
Yeah, and so I would say that I almost feel like all of them feed into the other and their buckets. So in relation to tackling climate change with greater urgency, I would say that, you know, we even see the unlikely climate activists now with like large investment managers like BlackRock committing to ESG because they physically can see the data, as Anna and others on the panel are mentioning, that some of their portfolios may actually be underwater. It's in their interest to invest in environmental, social, and governance practices then. And then we see that actually the bucket on protecting vulnerable groups, they will probably be victim to a lot of the climate, almost, I want to say, pandemics. They will fall further. They will probably not have access to the same things. They'll be displaced. There'll be a lot of climate refugees. A lot of our conflicts will be fought over resource allocation as well. I think then being able to enable those that are less vulnerable through things like education and technology are actually super integral. But again, when we talk about solutions, technology, I always, and Ari knows this well, I always say technology for good, right? So there's another thing within the survey that said, what is your biggest risk? Technology can actually be a force where, you know, you're breaching international securities law, like global governance will play out in a very different way. We're seeing a massive move from globalization to protectionism because we're all fighting our own fires. So again, when we think about vulnerability, I think then the third bucket would be education, because I was shocked to know that women in vulnerable groups are going to be most kind of seeded away from this situation. So lower economic situations. But again, in Sierra Leone in 2014, we saw a spike in teen pregnancies due to the Ebola crisis. It's not that these women won't be able to thrive, like their futures are slowly disappearing. So I think that education across for youth, but education for women in minorities or conflict zones will also be key to, you know, building the next forward.
Thank you very much, Nisa, for your perspective on these priorities, and I like the way you connect each one of them. What it would be good to get Pearl, your perspective from South Africa.
Sure. So not to sound like a broken telephone, but I do agree with the two ladies. You know, their sentiments that they've shared. But from an entrepreneurial, you know, perspective, maybe let me just, you know, zoom into specifically investing in more education and youth programs. And the other one that I wanted to add was the addressing inequalities that have deepened the results of COVID-19. So in SA, there was a particular research report that was done by an organization called Papamaseti, where they surveyed about 233 entrepreneurs from across 6 provinces, 6 out of the 9 provinces here in South Africa, and across 17 sectors, right? 77% of those were female entrepreneurs, and each one of those, out of the 233, They employed minimum, on average, 6 people, and 85% of them said that they had not received any grants from government. So, as we know, with many other nations as well, when the outbreak of COVID-19 happened, there were certain measures that were put into place where entrepreneurs could access like different funds to help their businesses stay afloat, right? But when you look at the compliance, right, that was required for these entrepreneurs or these businesses to access these different, mechanisms, right, that were put in place, a lot of them sort of fell in the middle. So what it said to us was that there's a gap in how we, especially here in South Africa, define SME, right? So in South Africa, you are either classified as informal or a formal business, SME, right? So what informal would usually mean, it means you informally have employed workers, you're not registered, you have a very small asset base. And when you are an SME, how that's defined is that you have under 50 employees, you have a turnover between 2 million and 25 million, and your assets range between 2 to 4.5 million. But then there's like SMEs that are like in the middle. These entrepreneurs would employ about 1 in 20 people. Their turnover could literally range from survivalist to anything up until 2 million. And then they're likely registered, but they don't fully comply, right? And when you look at this, a lot of them actually are in like rural areas and townships in South Africa, that would be peri-urban areas. And when you sit down with these entrepreneurs and you interrogate and you ask, okay, why do you not comply in this area, in that area? And there's a lack of information, right? But also again, because there's a lack of education and information from their end, they're unable to even access this information about the different mechanisms that the government or the private sector has put in place for them to assist their businesses to stay afloat, right? And then comes the tedious application process for them to access these different funds or to tap into these different funds, right? And a lot of these funds, in fact, were specifically for entrepreneurs or rather for businesses that, they would pay out, I suppose, the salaries to these different, to these employees that they have in their businesses. And then there were other, compliancy, measures that were put into place that this middle or this missing middle, of entrepreneurs that don't necessarily comply fully could not, access as a result, these the funds that were put into place or whatever other support, structures that, have been put together. So I think for me, I would probably emphasize more investment on education, skills development on youth. But I'll also go a step further and then say, particularly in rural areas, because in South Africa, if you look at the Statistic SA reports from our government, and you look at the unemployment rate, and you look at where these people are, where these young people are that are struggling to access employment or to even register businesses and run businesses sustainably, they're in the rural areas, they're not in the metros and the cities. And there's a huge gap in terms of access to information and education, for them to actually run sustainable businesses. So I would probably emphasize on that particular point.
Okay. Well, thank you. So I see that there's a trend there on education based on the conversation that we're having. But if we were to take a longer view, if we were to picture the world in 25 years, all right, what would be some of the things that you all would want to see? And Natalie spoke about big ideas or what people are thinking about big ideas. But in that context, I also want to pick up a question from one of the participants, which I think that should be aligned to this, because we cannot do, as Anna said at the beginning, all of this, we cannot do one thing without the other. But there's a question which says, what is the priorities of the SDGs in the eyes of the panelists for the future? Of course, apart from what was shared in the personal perspective, but this is a question from Panika Dasbuta. And I want you all to, in answering this question, look at it in the context of the long view of how you picture the world you want in 25 years. And who would like to go first?
I can jump in.
Okay, go ahead, Anna.
So it's the SDG question, and like how to prioritize this, is always the one that I think that I've been asked the most, and I keep giving like a lot of thinking about it. For the ones who do not know, when the SDGs were created, they were created in a way that they are interlinked. That means that they cannot be achieved one without achieving others. And we need to understand those interconnections in between. And overall, there are three categories of SDGs. There are the social ones, the environmental ones, and the economic ones. And I think that by answering that question, I will have to pick what is my top priority under those three pillars that the SDGs were built in. So if I were to say in those three things, the first one would be education. I agree with Nisa that everything that we want to achieve in the short term and in the long term starts with a proper education, and education both in terms of accessibility in all contexts and quality of the education that people are receiving, because those two aspects cannot be disconnected. We cannot just give access to education. We need to ensure quality in that education as well. The second SDG that I would prioritize, it would be sustainable consumption, and especially sustainable production, because I believe that this is not a chicken or egg question. I do believe that in order for us to have sustainable consumption, it starts by the production, and it starts by the companies role modeling the behaviors that we need to have in a new economy. And it is us as consumers, the responsibles, that make a decision every time that we buy a product to endorse or not endorse what are the production methods that companies are using to give us the goods that we need. And I would say that my last priority, it will be in terms of human rights and making sure that there is peace and justice around the world. You've seen that COVID-19, one, give a lot of visibility to the inequalities that already existed pre-virus, but second, not only make the things visible, it expanded the gap. So now we've seen that the people that have been more affected and that will be more affected is people that have been historically in disadvantages. We've seen it in North America with the African American community. We've seen it in like Latin America, when the World Health Organization has said, wash your hands and stay at home. And thousands and millions of people said, I don't have a home, or I don't have running water, or I don't have money to buy soap. And I think that this crisis made those things visible. And yeah, I cannot choose one, I have to choose three.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Anna. I mean, that's great in terms of your perspective on that. It makes total sense. I want to follow up on this particular question as well with you, Nisa, and I'm going to tag along a question from one of the participants. So all within the context of your looking at the world in 25 years and what you would want to see. We have a question from an anonymous participant, which says, how should governments structure their educational system? Because you all have been talking about education. How should governments structure their educational systems to create more responsive and resilient citizens who will be able to face the challenges relevant in the 21st century? So this is a two-pronged question to you. The one is the things that you want to see in a long-term view, but how do institutions like our governments respond in such a way that our citizens could be resilient and ready for that future that we all want?
Okay, well, loaded question. Thanks, I'm up to the challenge. I think I will respond to the second prong first in relation to how do governments need to kind of assess and revamp their systems. I would say one, it just leads through the other notion that a lot of times citizens within countries don't feel actually actively engaged or that their country is representing their best interests. So I think that there needs to be both a top-down and bottom-up approach where you have focus groups, where you have resources into being able to funnel through maybe disenfranchised groups to understand. Because what we're seeing now, which is very much like war times, is that people are going down into Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the bottom prong, where how are you going to educate those people into the next institutionalization of jobs where they'll feel incentivized to do them. And I would say what I would want for the world going forward to see that it is, again, like Anna said, is it's so specific to your need, right? So if there is an interest for education being somewhat sparse in a certain part of geography, specific jobs to potentially microfinancing in Ghana will not be the same in a specific geography in Canada. So I don't know if I've answered it, but appropriately, but in turn, I would say that there needs to be more of a transparency between them. I feel citizens need to feel more aligned and engaged, that their needs and their wants are also being funneled through government institutions and the education boards. And in the end, I would say that when you have education, it's democratizing access, right? Knowledge is power, knowledge is giving solutions, knowledge without solutions is dangerous. So I think that's what I would like to see.
Well, thank you very much, Nisa, with that. Let me go on to Pearl with reference. You spoke about access to education and, creating some kind of equality so that those who do not have access can have access. But I wanted to ask you one of the third questions that we have in our conversation here is, which of these global trends do you think will most affect our future? And I want you to put this in the context of the world in which we live today and the perspective that you have of young people not having access to the quality of education that you mentioned, or the young entrepreneurs not being able to meet up. What are some of the global trends that you think will most affect our future?
Sorry about that, I was muted, I didn't realize. So again, with these different options on the screen, I completely, I want to agree with all of them, but again, I will pick one and just focus on that. So just also from my own experiences, I'll probably go with the breakdown of relations between countries, particularly also here in Africa. So we all know about the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, that was ratified in last year in 2019. We have had the privilege of working with entrepreneurs or SMEs, not just here in SA, but also across other countries in the SADC region. And the interesting thing is that what we see here in SA or in South Africa, we see in other countries, as well. So what I had mentioned about, the access to, education, access to information and education, even in rural areas or peri-urban areas, is the same thing. We see the same thing in other countries as well that we see here, in South Africa. So I just feel like, when there is a breakdown of relations between countries, it will not only, I suppose, be in direct conflict with what that ratification meant, the African Free Trade Agreement means, but also again, in my world, I am Afro optimist, and I do believe that Africa should get to a point where we're able to trade with each other. So Lesotho and Namibia and Botswana entrepreneurs are able to connect with South African entrepreneurs and trade easily. Obviously getting there, is a different conversation altogether, but I feel like, for us as well as Africa to get to realizing this dream or this vision that we have to trade amongst each other, the breakdown in relations between the countries would probably be one of those global trends that will mostly affect our future. And probably, obviously answering, in the context of Africa as opposed to the world. But yeah, so my view is particularly that point. And, again, when you open up,
Sorry, we lost Pearl there for a minute. Well, I think you're back now. Okay, we lost Pearl there for a minute. We're going to make sure that we connect with her. But in line of the conversation that she was talking about, we have a poll that we're going to run now, which she was just talking about, breakdown in relation between countries. And one of the things that we're looking at is how do we rebuild better a global economy? So we want to ask this question to our audience, and on the other side, we'll come back to the panelists. How important or not is it for countries to work together to rebuild the world economy at this time? And I can see that there has been a lot of conversation in the chat room about collaboration. So let's see what the perspective is from the panelists, whether in trying to rebuild the global economy, is it really important that countries are working together? What are the lessons, some of the lessons that we've learned with COVID-19? In the meantime, I hope we can find a way to reconnect with Pearl. I think she's connecting back, so we'll get back to her. Yeah. So we have our survey results in. 78% of the participants, about 122 of you, say that it's really essential. Another 21% say it's very important that we work together. So this is important. With that in mind, I'm going to turn the question over to our participants to talk about global solidarity. So to each one of you, because the panelists didn't take the survey, how important or not is it for, I would begin with Nisa on this. How important or not is it for countries to work together to manage all the above trends that we've spoken about? Particularly in this conversation, I see we've highlighted education a lot, we've highlighted access, and what climate change. How important is that for collaboration?
So I would say it's an essential part of building back. And I think that the genesis and the thesis of the forum is actually quite lovely. That's like rebuilding better. So for instance, the first example we take is in relation to international travel. There was no real global response that was harmonized. There were higher infections rates. If there was more of a global response against governments, we would perhaps be further along. I don't know if I can put that out there. And there's ways that we would have a centralized approach. We see this again with COVID in just with medical care. And we're moving away from more protectivist notions that I would like to, it's very much like you get on a plane, protect your own and your child. Let's not help the person who's disabled next to me. And I would say that that is where we're moving. And if we were able to then knowledge share, bridge the gap and have a harmonized approach, we would definitely be further on. And I know that I'm jumping the gun here, but shaping our future, and do we feel optimistic about the future? I think definitely, because we have knowledge, there are solutions available, and we can rebuild better, but we also need to be very careful about being able to work with our partners alongside us, because together we're definitely stronger.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, I always joke that our global response to the COVID-19 has been from our tribal perspective rather than from our global perspective, and yet the virus itself has affected us in a global way. I'm going to, and Pearl, I'm going to come back to you to follow up on this, on the conversations we were having. But I want to go on to Anna to just ask you, has COVID-19 changed your views on cooperation between countries?
I would say my vision for cooperation between countries before COVID was that it was extremely essential. I work in an organization that believes that no issue can be solved by one single stakeholder. In the organization that I work for, we truly believe that multi-stakeholder cooperation, not only in the public sector, but with the private sector, with civil society, and with all the actors involved, is the fundamental basis to solve any problem. So I already thought that that was a no-brainer, like it's a must. Then COVID happened, and no, it didn't change my perspective. It made me even more reassured that that is the way. However, I think that there are a lot of learnings on the how. As Nisha has said, pardon, it's not enough to have the information. You have to know what is the solution that you offer. And I think that is what I believe it is the biggest learning that this whole experience is giving to the world. And if yes, cooperation, but the answer is how, and how can we get the will?
Thank you. Really, cooperation is key. How do we do it? How do we do it is a question that we all have to answer for the future. Let me just throw this out to you, Pearl. Overall, what do you think that people in 2045, looking ahead, what do you think the world would look like in 2045? Will it be better off, worse off, or the same as it is today? What is your conviction?
Sure. So before I get into that, really apologies, I disconnected because we had a power cut just briefly, so I had to change from Wi-Fi to my mobile data. And I suppose, I mean, I live in the suburbs, but we still have infrastructure issues such as power cuts. Going back again to my point earlier about, focusing on rural areas, because one can only imagine what it is there. If you ever wanted to connect to access information online and be part of such conversations as well online. So now just to answer your question, so I think it really is dependent on the effort that we make now. It could be better, it could be worse, or it could remain the same if everyone, and when I say everyone, I am not only, I'm obviously avoiding to just say government need to put effort in making sure that this and that happens, but everybody involved, in making the world a better place. So this would be corporates, this would be social enterprises, governments, everybody, entrepreneurs, whatever measures that we put into place and outcomes that we get from conversations and gatherings such as these. What do we do with that information? Do we go after this and implement, relook the way in which we are carrying out our projects, whatever projects those are? Are we looking at ways in which we are improving how we are getting research, right? Even from the ground, is it just desktop research? Do we go into these communities and not assume that what is a problem to us is a problem to them, right? And we have a lot of those here in South Africa where you get like, research reports where there's a lot of assumptions. I'll also just give an example of some project that was done a while ago by a particular organization, which I, obviously will not name. We went into this community, rural community, and they wanted to, they came in and they were like, oh my goodness, the women in this area, the women in this rural area, they have to walk really long distances to go and fetch water at a nearby river. And so they came in, they spent millions of dollars, building taps closer to where the women are, right? And over time, they realized that the same women were not necessarily using or making use of what they have been, given. So these taps that were now closer, and when these women are asked, well, why are you not using these? Because is this not more convenient for you? And the women just said, well, for us to walk long distances is social time. I get to catch up with my neighbor. I get to share. It's my therapy. I get to bounce off ideas and share just how much of a headache my husband is giving me back at home, right? But for them, you come into a place and you assume that the problem that you, or rather the convenience that you have in whatever space that you exist, is a problem to other people as well, right? So just going back again, I think that I don't have one answer whether it will be better, the same, or worse. I just say that it is dependent on the efforts that we that we put into place, and what do we do with the information and the outcomes, and such beautiful conversations such as these. We go back as individuals and make sure that this is my responsibility in my own space. I'm going to take the info, the data that I have gained here, and go and rethink the way in which I am doing things, or rethink the way in which I am assisting whatever group of people that you are assisting. So I don't have one answer.
Good. So if it's going to get better, it's going to largely depend on us. Let me just ask you all one last question. I see that there's a lot of conversations. Some of the questions in the Q&A you all have answered. I'm going to come back, but there's one question that I want to just touch on about from one of the participants, and this is really about inequality, and this comes from Sanda Bala, and it says, in order to address entrenched inequality and to drive sustainable consumption and production, would we need to rethink the global economic order and power structures that support and benefit from it? If so, what can we do about that? I'm just going to go straight to Nisa, and with that question, what would be?
Okay, I mean, hopefully the other two could help me out. Sorry, could you start again? Because I was looking at the
Well, the essence is that for us to, what can we do to address inequalities by looking at sustainable consumption and production? How can we do this?
I think that there's always several prongs to something like that. So if we're saying how we as citizens can do it, or how we as governments can do it, I would say that Anna was saying sustainable consumption, and also what we buy as consumers. I think that more than anything is an attitude problem back, right? I'm opposed to doing certain things. I'm breaking down a structure, and ultimately corporates and others will then find other ways to do that. And again, just from my background, I've seen this within like the ESG space. There's metrics in and around how people are starting to invest, and they actually have ESG or SRI metrics baked into their investment model, because people are choosing to consume and break down, old models. They want to know that as a beneficiary who's receiving this good, they're going to be in a position to be able to find other ways to consume going forward.
Well, thank you very much, Nisa. With that, Anna, would you want to follow up on that with reference to power structures, the current economic order, things that need to be done for us to be able to address things like sustainable consumption and production?
Sorry, I was muted. I'm going to follow up the framework that Nisa provided, and there are different responsibilities that different actors have to take. And I think that it is clear for all of the people that is right now sitting in this audience to evaluate your role as consumer, to evaluate your role as citizen, to evaluate your role as a professional who is working in a company. So as a consumer, again, as we've said before, every time you make a purchase, you are endorsing a specific method of consumption. It is difficult and it's time consuming to make the homework of tracing how this product was made, where does it come from, what is the ecological footprint on it, but it's the responsible thing to do. Second, put your hat as citizen and then think, who are the politicians that you're voting for? Are they actually going to regulate the industries that are creating the production methods in the right way? Or are these politicians going to further amplify the system? So don't forget your responsibility, because it's not only a privilege, but it's a responsibility to vote in an informed way, in a way that aligns to your values. And then third is, think of you as the CEO of your company or as the employee of a company that you're working for. Is my company actually setting up the right standards to ensure that all of our production methods, all of our working standards are actually in line to this new economic rebuild? Because I think that, just to close, we cannot expect for others to continue fixing the world for us. It requires cooperation, as we've said before, but it requires every single citizen with all the different hats that a citizen has to wear to make an effort in it. And only when we do it together in a substantial way, we will be able to make progress in a substantial way.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm going to stick with the same question and go on to Pearl. So how do we level things up? How do we, you emphasized a lot the imbalances, but how do we make sure that it doesn't just end with this conversation? What can, and there is a question from Jose Diaz Rodriguez, which really turns about that. It says, how can we fight the indifference and apathy of people in the face of these great challenges that we're facing? It puts a spin on Anna's conversation about our role as citizens. How can we fight this indifference where we're getting people involved in the conversation?
Sure. So again, it's just riding on what Anna had mentioned, that there would be different responsibilities for different players or people, right? Whatever sector that you operate in. It doesn't. I think with a lot of us, like we usually tend to just think that to make big change, it needs to be this really lofty project where you have big government names and and all these like lofty things, right? But you can start within the communities that you have access to. So if I have, because we all have privilege to a certain extent that other people may not necessarily have, and so even with the entrepreneurs, the SMEs that we work with, right? A lot of the times what we also do is we teach these entrepreneurs, these SMEs to to be sensitized to the the challenges within their different communities, right? That they could also lend a hand in. So the information that they might have, because also again you find that a lot of times for effective programs or projects to happen in certain communities, you would need people that understand the cultures of those different communities. And the best people usually would be those that either operate in that space or come from that space. And so when we just make sure that even with the SMEs that we work with, whenever they want to give back or they're in a position to give back, doesn't necessarily have to be money. It could be sharing of information, gathering people within that community to share information and assist in whatever way. Sensitizing people that we have access to our own circles. It doesn't, like, again, it doesn't have to be something so lofty and us then saying, the government really needs to do this or corporates needs to do that because there's so many millions in their accounts, but sensitizing the individual within your own circle, and also, again, taking that responsibility on yourself, right? What can I do? What knowledge do I have? And who are the people that I have access to that I can pass on that knowledge? for them to play a role as well in making the world a better place again, right? Or to achieve whichever SDG possible. So for me, it's just with the smaller things and the smaller efforts, right? What do you have access to? Who do you have access to? The communities that you have access to, and individuals that you have access to, and what can you give back? What can you offer? What can you? Is it offering them working in your business so that they gain a certain skill because they cannot afford maybe to go to to some college somewhere? Is it you sharing information and gathering them in some community hall, whatever it is, right? But taking that responsibility, personalizing it, and then being intentional in you wanting to then pass on whatever information or empowerment, whatever empowerment looks like where you're from, right? So I think just to sum it up, to sum it all up, it's taking personal responsibility, making it your own.
Thank you very much, Pearl, for that. Before we go on to the final question that I'm going to ask all of you, the panelists, we're going to pause here and just in line with the conversation that we're having, take stock of what our audience is thinking about participation in transforming the economy. And so the question that we have is, what part will you play in rebuilding the economy for a better future? We want to see or hear from you, the participants. You've had Anna, you've had Pearl and Nisa talk about our participation, the various stakeholders, whether it's governments, but individuals have a key role to play in this. And we want to know how you, who has been listening for the last hour, see yourself playing a part in designing a better future. What will you do? We'll give it a few 20 to 30 seconds, and then I would reveal what the outcome of that is, and then we'll go back to our panelists for their closing remarks. So please make sure we want to hear your voices. We want to see your participation in this conversation, and this is how we expect you to live here, knowing that you have a role to play as well in building this future. So here we go. So the question was, what part will you play in rebuilding the economy for a better future? About 12% said you will implement inclusive economic practices. We've heard a lot about the inequalities that exist. 27%, this is a good one, of you say that you would advocate for policy change. So I will put the world on notice that there's people coming for change. 9% of you say you would demand economic accountability from our elected leaders. 18% will encourage other citizens to implement inclusive economic practices. 9% of you will invest in not-for-profit organizations focused on sustainable economic development. And 27% say you will advocate implementing sustainable and inclusive economic practices at work. That is really great. So two things that stand out is that most of us will become advocates for policy change, and we will be holding our employers and businesses accountable. With all of this conversation taking place today, I'm going to go back to our panelists and say, and ask, what would you advise the UN Secretary General to do to address these global trends that we've been speaking about? I'm going to begin, reverse the thing. I'll begin with you, Cindy, or Pearl, as I've known you. What if you were sitting in the hot seat of the UN Secretary General, what would you do? What would be your advice to the UN Secretary General?
This is a very, very tricky question for me because there's just a lot that's going on in my head right now. But again, you know, just going back to my point about, you know, education, you know, also again, I think one of the ladies has spoken about, had said that it's not just, you know, access to education, but also the quality of the education. So I will stick to that particular point, but maybe my advice then would be to the Secretary General, looking into education that is human-centered, right? Not just, you know, textbook type education, right? That is far fetched from the context in which these people live in. And so, yeah, so that would be my, you know, my advice, to invest more in education that is more human-centered, and also focus again largely on the rural and township, you know, areas as well. To also consider that. So that would be my advice. I think the Secretary General is more than enough, you know, or rather more than equipped to see what that means and, you know, create the programs around that. But human-centered education would essentially be my advice.
Thank you very much. And I will go on to Nisa.
Again, a very loaded question, but just going forward, I would say that the three buckets, again, that we would focus on would be a lot of research and data that will go into this next. I appreciate everyone's tired of hearing the new normal, the newer normal going forward. And as we see marginalized groups affected by climate change, as we see marginalized groups affected by no education, as we see marginalized groups such as women in conflict zones being a little more affected as well, I would love to have the UN Secretary General be very aware of the buckets and how that would then change. So tackling climate change would be in a very different way as it was potentially even 9 months ago, because things have been escalated. We need to resource allocate in very different ways, and being very aware of how our resources are then tailored to, again, education, and how we're then educating our youth if jobs and international trade and our supply chain is going to change very radically as well. And then again, what Anna said, as well as what Pearl said, I've commented on Anna several times, but it's just about us being very active citizens and accountable. So every time we buy something, every time we make a developed decision about our political engagement, we should be very aware of what we're doing, because we are rebuilding the future going forward.
Thank you very much, Nisa. And I'll go on to Anna. What would be your advice?
I think the United Nations Secretary General has an impossible job, and doesn't matter what he or she does, it's always never going to be enough. And I would like to invite the participants to remember what the mandate of the United Nations is and how the United Nations is funded. Because while we can ask for a lot of investment in education or policy in like regulation, that is outside the scope of what the UN can actually do. But what the UN can do, and I think that it's something that it has done somewhat, but it has an opportunity to do much better, is to look at the 7 billion people that exist around the world as an army for a good, positive force. And I think that while the UN cannot impose governments to implement X or Y policy, the UN can empower the citizens of those countries with the right tools for those citizens to self-organize, for those citizens to make sure that they know how to advocate for policies, which was the most voted answer by the audience in this call. But if I were to ask the citizens, do you know how to organize to do a policy advocacy? Most of them will say no. And then even if they do, and the policy gets approved, do the citizens know how to keep their politicians accountable? Not really. And I think this is a unique role that the Secretary General and his whole team could play in a very neutral and impartial way.
Thank you very much, Anna. I think that this is a good way for us to have concluded with almost a call to action from you, the panelists, to the participants, but also from the perspective that it's not just the UN that's going to make the change, it's all of us that will participate. I'm going to turn over now to the host of this dialogue, who comes from the UN SDG Action Campaign, and whose mandate is actually mobilizing citizens of the world to participate in implementing the Sustainable Development Goals of that were adopted by the United Nations. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Marina Ponti.
Thank you, Ari, and thank you, Anna, Nisa, Pearl, and Natalie for a very insightful and powerful contribution. It's always a very difficult task to close these dialogues because they're so rich, but I really try to convey some of the points that really inspire me. Both, from the panel perspective, but I've also been looking at the chat and some of the very engaging conversation. First of all, I'm so happy that we have such a very optimistic group of people. In the world today, there are like two camps. There is a camp of very pessimistic people, and some of the panelists were mentioning about the apathy of people not believing that change is possible. I'm part of like this group of a lot of people believing that we are at a turning point, and that it's actually possible to make a bold decision and to make bold changes. And I think Natalie mentioned at the beginning that 2020 is going to be defined by the decision taken, and not just incremental improvement here and there on health, on education, on climate, but really shift in paradigm, talking about taxation, debt, or somebody mentioned in the chat, power distribution, and really inequalities and inclusion in society. So I think these are the issues at stake, and we all need to be engaged in the conversation. Another very interesting conversation that emerged in a few of the intervention was about the individual role. As you know, I always appear with this butterfly on my back, which signify the butterfly effect. So each one of us can start a butterfly effect. And I have no illusion, as somebody put in the chat, that of course, no matter how empowered or how responsible we are or how active we are, of course, the changes that we need are at the global level, at the various levels. We're talking about production partner, we're talking about international agreement, international, division of powers, but at the same time, start can happen from each one of us. And I really like the way Anna, mentioned the free role of each one of us in terms of, first of all, as a consumer, as an active participant in our society, the changes we can make. And the second, and I always mention it about when we vote, of course, in countries where this is possible, by voting, we can actually empower people that have the same vision towards the goal or toward the changes we want to see. And also, I really like, and he came also from the polling, this all about advocacy, because if it's true that the changes that we need are at many levels and including at the global level, the advocacy can start from each one of us. And I think in this, particularly in this digital time where access and information is more equally accessible, we can really raise our voice and be very loud advocate for the values and the priority we believe. I love, going back to Hannah, I love what you said about there is no one solution. And I think this is, to me, one of the great thing about the SDG is that it's a milestone, it's a framework, but then every society has to really identify the gaps, the need, who are those left behind, and for the strategies to be successful, they need to take really in consideration the local context. And I think, Nisa, you said something which it really struck me, that the situation is somehow, what's happening with COVID is exposing some of the fragility of our societies. I myself sometimes use even a stronger term, particularly also looking at the Black Lives Matter movement. I think COVID exposed some of the failure of our systems, and somehow now we have all a responsibility to join forces and advocate for a change, so that the social contract that the goals represent between citizen and institution is renewed on new terms and new fair terms. I really agree with your emphasis on education, and I think you brought a lot of very inspiring example about the community left behind, if it's a rural community or particularly women and girls. And I think that the COVID exposed the kind of a greater impact that the pandemic had on women, not just as health workers, but also as mother, in terms of also increase violence in homes, and also in terms of loss of jobs and income. So let me see, it was extremely inspiring. I also kind of going back to Natalie, really emphasize that we are living, very important times. As Natalie mentioned, it's the first time since the 90s that the human development indicators are declining. But at the same time, I'm extremely hopeful that through, as some of you, perhaps Pearl mentioned, through personal responsibility, through advocacy, I see many more people wanting to play a part and become advocate. We can really turn the page. We can really turn things around to build a new future which is just, which is green, which is sustainable and fair.
Well, thank you very much, Marina, for that conclusion. Thank you to the SDG Action Campaign for giving people across the world the opportunity to participate in this conversation. I know we've slightly run above our time there, but I think the conversation was worthwhile. I would say to the audience, please stay tuned. Follow the SDG Action Campaign on all its social media platforms. We will continue to have this conversation with you in different formats from the SDG Action Campaign. And thank you very much. This is the last of the 3 series of the UN SDG Action Campaign. But stay tuned, go on and make the change that you want to see in the world. Thank you very much for attending. Please be safe.